There have been many changes to the legal system in the UK in recent years which have led to serious debates about fairness and equality. One of the most debated innovations has been the introduction of new pre-trial reports, which now take into account factors such as the race, gender, and social status of the defendant when sentencing. The idea was to try to correct historical injustices and create a more inclusive justice system that takes into account not only the actions of the offender but also their personal circumstances. However, the change sparked widespread backlash and fierce debate about whether it was fair and consistent with traditional principles of justice.
That there have been infringements on free speech that actually affect not just the British, of course what the British do in their own country is up to them, but also affect American technology companies and by extension American citizens. So that is something that we'll talk about today at lunch.
We've had free speech for a very, very long time in the United Kingdom, and it will last for a very, very long time. Well, no, I mean, certainly we wouldn't want to reach across US citizens, and we don't, and that's absolutely right. But in relation to free speech in the UK, I'm very proud of our history there.
J.D. Vance, a prominent American politician and social activist, has not been left out of the discussion of these changes. In his criticism, he emphasizes that such steps could deal a serious blow to the foundations of the British legal system, which has always valued the principles of fairness and equality. In turn, many other critics believe that this system creates inequality because in the end, a judge can assess a crime not only on the basis of what a person has done, but also on the basis of what social group he or she belongs to. Thus, for some defendants, punishment may be lessened due to their race or gender, while others, such as white Britons, may be punished more severely for the same crimes. Vance, referring to such changes, insists that this not only undermines the very essence of justice, but can lead to far more dangerous consequences. He notes that such practices create a two-tiered justice system in which the same criminal can receive different sentences, depending on which social or ethnic group he or she belongs to. This means that justice becomes influenced by personal characteristics rather than the objective circumstances of the case. The principle of equality before the law, on which British justice has always been based, is beginning to lose its force. The very existence of such changes in the justice system raises questions about whether justice in the British courts is really the same as it was before, or whether it has been undermined. Whereas justice used to primarily take into account the actions of the accused, now it is beginning to take into account personal characteristics that have absolutely nothing to do with the commission of the crime. This undermines the fundamental principles on which the legal system is built. For Vance, as for many other critics, it is important to preserve the idea that everyone should be punished or acquitted solely on the basis of their actions, not their social or ethnic background. However, proponents of this reform argue that it is necessary to correct historical injustices and compensate for the negative consequences that have occurred in the past, especially for minorities. Ideally, such a system would balance out old wrongs and create a fairer society. But in reality, things turned out to be much more complicated. Instead of smoothing out social and racial differences, the new system has created more division and resentment. For example, many people in Britain, especially those from white British backgrounds, began to feel disadvantaged because they were worse off in sentencing. Against the backdrop of such sentiments, it is not surprising that the issue has become so high on the public agenda and has drawn sharp criticism from the public and politicians. J.D. Vance also points out that such reforms pose a threat to long-term social peace in the UK. He warns that such a system could deepen social divisions and increase feelings of injustice among different groups. Ultimately, it could damage the very basis of the UK's democratic system, where the law must always be blind and impartial. Creating a system where the same crime can lead to different consequences for different people depending on their identity destroys the very essence of what we call justice. In addition, critics argue that such changes call into question the principle of universal justice. After all, while the law used to treat all citizens as equal, regardless of their background, this is no longer the case. A system that takes into account the race, gender, or social status of the accused risks turning justice into a tool of political correctness which, according to Vance, is a threat to all citizens, not just those subject to these changes. With every step the UK takes in this direction, it moves away from its liberal traditions, which have always prioritized the principles of equality and justice for all. Equally important is the fact that this system could ultimately lead to a breakdown in the foundations of civic cohesion. In a society where laws begin to differ according to an individual's personal characteristics, discontent and even disillusionment with the legal system can arise. This not only violates trust in the authorities but also contributes to social tensions. Each new case where a person receives a harsher punishment for the same crime just because they belong to a certain group can increase feelings of injustice and cause protests. Thus, with each step, the UK is moving further away from its historical principles of justice, replacing them with a system that tries to please modern political trends rather than follow the basic tenets of justice. This results in a country once known for its fair and impartial system, now facing the question of whether it can keep its traditions or be forced to follow new, more controversial rules that may jeopardize its national identity and social stability. J.D. Vance did not miss the opportunity to criticize the leader of the UK Labour Party, Keir Starmer, for his behaviour in light of the reforms related to the new sentencing rules and their impact on society. Despite Starmer's best efforts to portray himself as a champion of minority rights, Vance emphasizes his hypocrisy with increasing persistence. The whole situation of the two justice systems he talks about, in the context of race and gender preferences, resonates quite well with Starmer's own comments. He has repeatedly stated that change is necessary to correct historical injustices, especially against minorities, but Vance sees this as mere political hypocrisy. At a time when Starmer is making public statements of support for new laws and regulations, claiming that they will help create a more equal society, in doing so he fails to brush aside a number of issues that make it difficult to accept his position. One such issue, for example, is Starmer's changing views on immigration and border control. His earlier statements that the UK should leave the doors open to anyone who wishes to enter contrast sharply with his current statements, in which he pretends that he has suddenly become an advocate of stricter immigration measures because public opinion has begun to change dramatically. It becomes apparent that Starmer's position was shaped not by inner convictions but by political tactics aimed at appealing to different constituencies. This turnaround in his political strategy undermines his credibility. Starmer, according to Vance, is constantly changing his position depending on what is politically just and advantageous at the time. The same can be said of his responses to questions about changing justice in the UK. He seems to have raised the issue of systemic racial and gender injustices in the legal system, and has even publicly expressed concern about the new approach, but his actions don't match his words. This raises serious questions about how sincere his intentions are and how willing he really is to fight for justice. Vance argues that in this case Starmer is little more than a politician who is willing to make compromises just to hold on to power, rather than actually standing up for principles that affect all UK citizens. Furthermore, when Starmer claims that free speech is flourishing in the UK, J.D. Vance strongly disputes these claims. He emphasizes that freedom of expression, upon which the entire British legal system has traditionally stood, has been increasingly restricted in recent years, most notably through hate speech laws. Vance points out that such laws have become tools for suppressing critical voices and creating a climate of fear among citizens. In recent years, laws against hate speech have become stricter in the UK, and while justified on the grounds of protecting vulnerable groups, in practice they often result in people who speak out being harassed. This approach limits freedom of speech and leaves aside the basic principles on which Vance believes a democratic system should be based. This fear of a lot of politically incorrect speech, which is felt in the UK, undermines the very foundations of a democratic society, Vance argues. In his speech, he gives examples of how the law can be used to penalize people for expressing their political views. Significantly, these laws, while enacted to combat hate speech, are in fact often used to stifle normal political debate. To say the least, even the most seemingly innocent speech can be censored if it does not conform to the official political line. Thus, the old principles behind the idea that every citizen has the right to free expression are beginning to crumble. Vance raises another important issue: the use of these laws for political manipulation. It is clear to him that governments, including the current UK leadership, are using these laws not to protect people's rights, but to increase control and suppress opposition. In particular, those who criticize the government or express an opinion different from the official line are easily targeted for prosecution on charges of hate speech. This makes people afraid to speak out openly for fear of repercussions such as fines, arrests, or other sanctions. While for Starmer free speech seems important only as part of his political platform, for Vance free speech is the foundation of a democratic society. In his view, this issue cannot and should not lend itself to political manipulation. When freedom of expression is restricted by laws that can be used to persecute political opponents, it threatens the very existence of a democratic system. And so, despite all these changes, political figures like Starmer continue to argue that all these measures serve the public good. J.D. Vance, however, sees this as a serious misconception that could lead to the destruction of the very foundations of the legal order in the UK. He warns that without proper control and resistance to these trends, the UK could lose its old democratic traditions and the justice system would be replaced by a system that, instead of upholding justice, would be based on political gain. Ultimately, Vance warns this will lead to the consolidation of power by elites and politicians willing to use any means to achieve their goals, including manipulation of justice and free speech laws. In light of recent changes to the British legal system, and in the context of criticisms put forward by figures such as J.D. Vance, the UK faces a real threat of losing its former values. A system that once served as a model for other democracies now risks becoming part of a global trend that undermines traditional liberal democratic principles. J.D. Vance has repeatedly pointed out in his speeches that the UK, once considered a bastion of freedom, truth and justice, is now beginning to threaten these values. He emphasizes that the loss of these foundations is not just a loss of legal integrity, but a significant weakening of national identity. In his view, Britain, along with other Western countries, is moving down a path that could lead to the destruction of democracy as we know it. Above all, this relates to the changes that have taken place in approaches to justice. J.D. Vance believes that any attempt to reform the legal system, to make it more inclusive and fair in terms of equality for all social groups, has serious consequences. New laws that now take into account characteristics such as race, gender, and social status have the potential to radically alter jurisprudence, undermining the very essence of what makes the justice system fair. All of these changes, Vance argues, have led to a system in which justice is no longer blind or neutral, but begins to depend on who is standing trial. Whereas until now the right to fair punishment has been the foundation of British law, there are now situations where the same act can be punished differently depending on who committed the crime. But these changes are only part of a wider picture in which Britain faces a serious challenge at the level of its fundamental principles. Vance notes with particular concern that the tendency to simplify and erode liberal values, such as free speech and individual liberty, is common not only in the UK but also in other countries. And already these new practices are beginning to spread beyond the UK, threatening other nations including the US and Australia. J.D. Vance argues that by following the British example, many countries may soon face the same problems when laws aimed at social justice begin to threaten the basic rights of citizens, such as freedom of speech and freedom of expression. When the UK becomes an example for such global change, Vance warns that it could lead to a major crisis. He emphasizes that the main threat lies not only in changing legislation, but also in how these changes will be interpreted and applied in the future. The established system, based on the principles of democracy and liberal ideology, will no longer be able to effectively protect the rights of citizens if justice is not based on equality before the law, but on favoring certain groups. In this context, just as with other legal systems, it is important to remember Britain's unique role in world politics. A country that was once seen as the embodiment of the ideals of freedom is now questioned about its role in maintaining democratic standards on the international stage. Vance points out in his remarks that if Britain continues on a path that leads to a weakening of its legal traditions, it will mean that the world is losing one of its last bulwarks in the struggle for true freedom. However, Vance realizes that this situation is not unique to the UK alone. He sees it as a manifestation of a broader trend that encompasses many Western democracies. He points to the US, where he believes there are serious risks that identical practices that have come to the UK could begin to permeate the American justice system as well. Already, Vance says America could face the same problems as the UK, especially when it comes to the right to free expression and political correctness, which is being tried to be enforced through hate speech laws. In this context, Vance emphasizes that if such laws continue to proliferate in Western countries, they will seriously undermine the tradition of free speech, making it impossible to have a normal political discussion and fight against real issues. However, his most worrying point is that the changes that are taking place in the UK are already beginning to affect international politics. He warns that if such laws and practices are successfully introduced in other countries, it will lead to a huge erosion of traditional democratic norms, including freedom of speech and the right to freedom of expression. It will mean that social justice, as we understand it today, will gradually give way to political correctness, which is based not on solving real problems but on the desire to please various pressure groups. For Vance, these changes also mean a threat to the very essence of what he calls liberal democracy. In his view, the whole essence of liberal democracy was that everyone should be free and equal before the law, regardless of their race, gender, or social status. Now, as the UK begins to legislate to allow these factors to be taken into account in sentencing, that basis is beginning to crack. This undermines the very idea of justice based on equality and brings about significant changes in the social structure. Vance concludes that, Despite attempts to justify these reforms as a way of improving society, they can lead to the destruction of the very foundation of the legal order. In this context, not only Britain but also other countries that follow its example risk losing what makes them unique: their commitment to human rights, justice, and freedom.